this party. And good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? We can start, folks. Torrance just showed up. There you go. We can never start class until he gets here, so now that he's here, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming today. You're like a good bellwether. You let me know that it's time to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody. I see we have Gloria in the audience, Sky, Zohed, Elizabeth, Haley, Sarah, a bunch of online students. And we have a pretty good class here in the seated classroom. Everybody, if you would, go ahead and wave hello to my audience at home. There you go. Fantastic. I know they hate that. They have that look anytime I want my family to take a picture as well. Now, if you would, I'd like to go ahead and quickly make a couple of announcements. As I mentioned the other day, the writing assignment 1 and writing assignment number 2 rewrites will not be accepted after this Sunday. So if you need to do a rewrite for 1 or 2, go ahead and get it done. If you've already done that, that's fine as well. Now, next week is the July 4th week. July 4th has been placed conveniently on Tuesday, right in the middle of the week. So we are going to have class ever so conveniently on Monday. There will be a live class in this building Monday at 1:30 p.m. My online students, I am recording this, so if you're busy and can't come to the live broadcast, that's fine. For my online students here, remember, you can choose to come once a week to an online class. So if you need to come to an online class on Monday, I could understand that. Any questions? Any questions? Okay. Now, what I wanted to show you folks before we get started, and those people at home can see this. Remember, we were talking about consciousness, and I told you that consciousness is the future of psychology. I talked about the 4 epochs of psychology. And then in the second module, it was brain biology and the search for consciousness. They've just had a sort of, they have science sometimes proceeds adversarially. So they've got this little contest where competing theories of how consciousness work went to a big conference, and they competed. They tested both of these theories to see which one could account for the data the best. And it turns out that the models supported by the philosophers beat the models supported by the neuroscientists at this time. If anybody's interested in nerd stuff like this, I would be more than happy to share this article with you. But I just don't know, when I was talking about brain biology and the search for the soul and consciousness and the modes of psychology, the epochs, I thought maybe you might not believe what I'm talking about. But I'm serious. Right now, they're still trying to figure out. Neuroscientists and philosophers are still trying to figure this thing out called consciousness. Now, what they're looking at is what we call the easy problem of consciousness. They're talking about where it's contained. Is it more in the back of the brain or the front of the brain? But they still haven't even begun to think about the hard problem. Why do you like chocolate and why do you like peanut butter? We have no idea about the hard problem, but they can tell you where. They're beginning to wonder where in the brain consciousness is. Okay, I can see from your eyes that absolutely thrilled you folks, and that's fine. So let's go ahead and continue on with our talk about developmental psychology. If you'll remember, on Monday I suggested to you that developmental psychology is here and is useful and vital because it extends our lifespan. And not only our lifespan, it improves our well-being, how happy and productive we are. And we even watched a video showing how average lifespan has really increased in the last 200 years. And that's all due to things that we've learned about developmental psychology. And I suggested to you that there were some biological things that we know about with regard to developmental psychology. We know that the brain myelinates in a very predictable pattern. We know that during prenatal development, the body unfolds in a very specific, predictable pattern. We know about critical periods. We know about dendritic blooming and pruning. We know all of these biological things. And then I suggested to you another way we can think about human beings change is we change as a function of the environment, as a function of learning. And we talked about the difference between maturation and learning. Do you remember me talking about the difference between maturation and learning? Okay, would somebody be willing to tell me what the difference between maturation and learning is? And if there's somebody online who would like to tell me the difference between maturation and learning, I would appreciate hearing that from you as well. Can anybody tell me what the difference is? Yes, Mariana. Exactly. Yes. Great. Can you give me an example of a maturational change?
Changes in height and weight and, as you said,
Myelination, yeah.
Learning would be like how to write letter A.
Exactly right. You don't necessarily have to learn how to write a letter, but your height, puberty, is going to come upon you whether you want it or not, right? Okay, fantastic. And Andrew Withal, thank you very much. Andrew is our seated student over here. He's online today. Maturation is how the brain develops intrinsically, while learning requires experience. Right. Nature versus nurture. And every developmental topic that comes up, one of the main arguments is what part of the change represents maturation and what part of the change represents learning. Now, they may not use things like operant conditioning or classical conditioning or necessarily talk about a critical period, but what they're talking about is we're trying to suss out what part of human change is intrinsic and what part of human change is extrinsic. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about three different developmental topics and sort of show you the nature and the nurture of these topics. Now, if you go back to yesterday, I suggested to you, or actually it was in your notes, I may not have actually pointed it out. When we study human development, we study it along different trajectories. How you grow physically in terms of height and weight in the physical changes. But we also talk about cognitive development, how your brain changes and develops as you get older. And then we also talk about socio-emotional development. How does your personality change as you grow up and get older? And if you've ever seen human beings at different age groups, you'll know what I'm talking about. There are physical changes. You ever seen an infant? Their head is relatively big compared to the rest of their body, compared to human beings. That's a physical change. And because your head comes almost fully grown at birth and the rest of your body grows into it. That's a physical change. On the other hand, if you think about cognitive changes, you can play tricks on little 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds because they don't think as good as well as you are. They're not thinking as well as you are. And then if you think about personality, 2-year-olds act a certain way. We expect a certain amount of attitude and crying from a 2-year-old. On the other hand, William, if you started crying and throwing a tantrum in this class, we would all think it's probably pretty dadgum inappropriate of you, right? And so we know that emotional functioning changes too. Maybe we wouldn't? Okay, Kyung Kim's here. Thank you very much. Good to see you. All right, so let's talk about that. Now, the first thing that I'd like to talk about is this socio-emotional event that happens for each and every one of us, that happens for all mammals. It's this process of bonding, and we call this process attachment. Now, attachment is the complex and sometimes lengthy brain development and lengthy brain development in humans requires a certain amount of care from a primary caregiver. You are helpless at birth. You are going to be helpless for many years. So it is very important that you have a close relationship with the adult that gave birth to you. If you've ever seen spiders, as soon as they're born, they all scatter off in their own directions. Human beings are not like that. There's this bond that's required because of the brain development that must occur. Now, attachment is the process that occurs that allows a primary caregiver and their human being and their offspring to bond. Now, this research comes from way back. This ethologist named Konrad Lorenz found out this really cool thing he called imprinting. It turns out when animals are born, they will actually attach to the first thing that they see. He called it imprinting. And so what he did with these gray gosling geese is when they were born, he didn't let them see their mother. Instead, he was right there in their face the first 6 hours that these birds were born. And he was the one that fed them and took care of them over the first several hours of their life. And it turns out that these gosling geese attached to him, imprinted to him, and suddenly would follow him around the yard. And there are pictures of this ethologist, Konrad Lorenz, swimming with a row of geese behind him. And he found that there seems to be this automatic bonding that occurs right after birth. He didn't say why, he just noticed that happened in animals. Now, a fellow named William Bowlby, many years later, was working with children who had emotional disturbances, and he found that the most disturbed children were the ones that spent significant amounts of time away from their caregivers. And so he became interested in this idea that maybe there was something important about the first few years of life. And this fellow named, and the question became, why is the first few years of life important? Why is that first few years of life between an infant and their primary caregiver important? We know it's a critical period. It needs to happen during that time. But why does that bonding occur? Now, let's think about nature versus nurture. According from a behaviorist perspective, can somebody tell me why would an infant like their primary caregiver? Why would an infant bond to their primary caregiver? Torrance with an idea. Yes.
Because their primary caregiver keeps them alive.
Yes. Can we use words like punishment and reinforcement, because behaviorists would do that?
Because the caregiver tries not only to keep the baby alive, but also help it achieve self-sustainability using punishment and, what was the other one?
Reinforcement.
And reinforcement.
Reinforcement, right. What did B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists use as their reinforcement typically with the animals? What'd you say? Food. So wouldn't it make sense, why does an infant bond with a primary caregiver? Because the primary caregiver feeds them, reinforces that behavior. And that was the belief about the relationship between the primary caregiver and their child. But this guy, Harry Harlow, thought that there might be something more to the story. He thought that there might be some sort of instinctual basis for this, right? Yes, ma'am, you getting ready to say something?
I know about this.
You know about this study. Okay, so what he did was he took these monkeys, these little rhesus monkeys, the day they were born, and took them away from their moms so they had no contact at all, and put them in these cages. And in the cages, he put two kinds of mom. A very uncomfortable wire mom with a bottle with food, and a very soft, warm, fuzzy mom that had no food but just felt nice to snuggle on. And his question was, which monkey mother is this infant going to pay attention to? Now, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is show you this 3-minute video. So what I'm going to do right now for those of you at home is I'm going to put you on hold, and then I'm going to put the link in the chat bar for you. If you would, please go ahead and watch this 3-minute video on Harry Harlow's research for me. When you get done, come back to the live broadcast and we'll talk about it. Thanks. Okay, hold on, folks. Give me 2 seconds to get them started. There we go. There we go. And boom. There we go. All right, for y'all.
Newborn rhesus monkeys will grow up not in accordance with nature, but in the controlled atmosphere of a laboratory, where all the psychological influences of childhood can be duplicated. In a classic continuing study, infant monkeys are removed from the mother at birth and raised in semi-isolation. Other individuals can be seen and heard, but there is no physical contact, no interaction. Mother is a bit of plastic and shaggy cloth, a doll with no life of its own, but capable of nourishing the life of an infant. The monkey will come to depend upon this doll to satisfy basic necessities of life. Not only nourishment, but a deeper psychological need for comfort and security. In primate infants, there is an instinctive need to cling to another body, soft and warm. Food or security, which is motherhood's stronger appeal? Alongside a warm, familiar mother of cloth is a stark wire doll set up as nothing more than a feeding machine. The young monkey is placed deliberately on a cloth mother which has no milk to nourish him, but fulfills some fundamental needs. This experiment revolves around one simple question. Will the infant monkey switch his affection to a wire mother which offers food and life itself? Only when forced by hunger does he loosen his grip and begin to yield to nature's most powerful internal drive. From the wire mother, he derives one thing, nourishment. No warmth, no comfort, no feeling of security. After feeding, he returns to spend up to 22 hours a day near the only mother he knows. From this inanimate object, the infant derives all the security and mother love he needs. He can, if also exposed early to other young, grow into a normal, well-adjusted adult.
Okay. So, right? So, I mean, it seems kind of silly, but at the time, people really wondered about the nature of this relationship. And so what you see here is, number one, there's a critical period for this attachment. I will tell you that these monkeys that were brought up without parents were not able later to parent on their own. They weren't able to integrate with the other monkeys. And there are videos I could show you, but they're in the interest of time, but there are videos they take where these, when placed in cages with other monkeys, these monkeys cowered over in the cages with their hands over their heads because they were so shocked and shell-shocked from this lack of stimulation. Now, there is actually a clinical diagnosis that some children who are the subject of horrible childhood abuse, there is a disorder called reactive attachment disorder. Some kids that are abused, actually neglected, really being neglected is worse than being abused by your parents. And sometimes children that are completely neglected during the first couple years of life develop or never develop the ability to form human bonds and have these reactive attachment disorders. So one of the things we can say is there is an innate need in all of us that requires that we bond with a human being. It is not based on environmental reinforcement. It is not based on nurture. We all need this love. Now, a lady named Mary Ainsworth was interested in whether or not there were differences in patterns of attachment. Do all children bond with their primary caregiver the same way? Because one of the things that you'll notice is that there are some children who have attachment problems who maybe didn't grow up in a horrible environment. And she had the question, are there differences in attachment style? So what she did was she set up this really cool experiment called the strange situation paradigm to test how easily children were able to establish attachment. Now, how many of you have a sweetie, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, somebody you love that will miss you when you go away? Maybe a mom, a dad, somebody like that. Okay, you got somebody like that. Whenever you leave them, what's the last thing you do before you see them, before you leave them? You give them a hug. You build that sense of attachment. I miss you. I will see you in 2 weeks. And then you go away. And you miss them for 2 weeks. And then when you come back on the airplane, what's the first thing you do when you see mom or dad or boo or whoever it is? You run up to them and you give them a hug too. You reestablish attachment. I miss you, so let's hug and establish the fact that we love each other, right? And how long do you hug them for? 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? About 2 seconds. You give them a hug and then that's over and done, right? That's because you've got this normal attachment with this person. It's a very secure attachment. Now, what Mary Ainsworth wanted to do was to see, do all children have the ability to reestablish normal attachment? So she would bring children into the laboratory with their primary caregivers, typically moms in this day and age, and she would have the baby and the mom come in there, and what you'll notice is that the baby uses the mom as a secure attachment, a secure base to explore from. So a comfortable baby with their mom or primary caregiver, while the primary caregiver sits down, the child will wander around and explore. Kids love to do that, but one thing you'll notice is that every couple of seconds, they're looking back at mom or dad to reestablish contact. And as long as there are parents there, they're very confident and they engage in their exploratory behavior. She would then set it up so that a stranger would come into the room. Now, children have a normal fear of strangers during this attachment process called stranger anxiety. It is completely normal. 1-year-olds and 18-month-old kids are really afraid of new people. And so when this person comes in the room, the kid freaks out a little bit and comes a little closer to mom, but still explores. Then she sets it up so that mom gets up and walks out of the room and leaves the child alone with the stranger. Now, do you know what kids do in this situation? What a 1-year-old does in this situation? Cried unconsolably, right? Now, the question is, what happens when mom comes back in? How quickly does the baby stop crying? And what she found is that some of the children stopped crying almost immediately when mom comes back in the room and started exploring. These children, she said, had a secure attachment with their mom. When mom leaves, I miss you. When you come back, I hug you and everything's fine because I trust you. I have a secure base in you. But she found that not all the children were like that. 1/3 of the children were what she called anxious ambivalent, or what we now call, your book's going to call, resistant. And these were the clingy children. They were afraid, and when mom left and came back, they were so overwhelmed by anxiety that they couldn't put mom down. These were the children that would stop. They had trouble crying, stopping their crying, and they had trouble letting go of mom. They were clingy. She called those anxious ambivalent. They're now called resistant children. She found that still another third of them acted in a bizarre way. They were still crying, but they didn't want mom for comfort. They seemed angry at mom for leaving them. They wouldn't make eye contact, and they were trying to push their mom away. It's almost as if they wanted to punish their mom for leaving. And she termed these children avoidant children. So what she found is that not all children develop a secure attachment style with their parent. About 50% of us have this secure attachment style that we developed during the process, but some of us didn't. And the question is, what causes this? Are we all doomed? Is this lack of attachment something that's innate, or does this have to do with somehow or another with the environment that the mom puts the child in? And the earliest research in the 50s and 60s suggested that it might have something to do with how consistently the mom, the primary caregiver, met the children's need. So, in a sense, we've got this thing called attachment. It's an innate need. It's nature. It's nature, if you will. It has a timeline when it must occur. And so that's natural development. But then on the other hand, we have Mary Ainsworth saying, but the quality of that attachment may depend upon environmental reinforcement. Okay? Now, the question then becomes, how do we raise successful adults? Back in the 50s, in the height of the behaviorism in the 1940s and 50s, if you turned out poorly, it was your mom's fault, okay? Because your mom was there all of the time, your mom raised you, it was your mom's fault if you turned out poorly. It was your environment. And people discounted the impact that individual qualities might have. And so the question becomes, how early does personality begin to assert itself in children, okay? And what can we do about this? Now, these researchers in the 50s, Chess and Thomas, began this longitudinal research study that lasted for 30 years, from 1956 to 1986. And they followed these children the moment they were born, and then followed them through the rest of their lives. And what they wanted to find out was, what is the earliest part of your personality that we can say that is maybe innate, if you will? Because as an adult, if you're an unfriendly person, I can say, maybe it was your parents that made you unfriendly, right? And if my son turns out to have a bad temper, whose fault is it? It's my fault as the parent. So the question is, what aspect of personality is innate? And Chess and Thomas looked at children, and they looked at 9 different qualities. How active these children were, how much they liked regularity, how regular these children were, what they did when they initially saw things. Was it positive or negative? Did they have a general positive or negative orientation towards things? How intense were their reactions? Were they generally favorable or unfavorable in their general mood? How distractible were these infants? How long was these children's attention spans? And how much stimulation did these children like? And what they found is that starting at around the age of 5 or 6 days, you begin to demonstrate personality differences. These personality differences come so early that we can think of these as maybe being innate. We can see differences in children at 4 days of age. Now, you might say that's an environmental difference. I'm going to say 4 days is not a lot of environment to change your personality. And what they found was that you could really group children into 3 basic groups. They called these easy children, slow to warm up children, and difficult children. These easy children were those that generally had a positive mood, generally liked being stimulated, and generally were very regular in their sleeping, eating, pooping, and showed a rhythmicity, a very regularity. So some children, what you're going to find when you folks become parents, you're going to find some of your children are super duper easy babies. They're happy, they're regular, they're easy to take care of. But occasionally, and this always seems to happen to the second child, you know, if it happened to the first one, you might not have that second one, right? But that second one sometimes is going to be difficult. It's not going to have such a positive attitude. It's going to have more intense and more negative reactions to things. This child may not like rhythmic behaviors. It may have trouble going to sleep, getting up. And they found that some of these babies are what they called difficult children. And then there were some that seemed kind of shy and not interested in stimulation, but they weren't really hard children. They were just shy children, so they called them slow to warm up. And what Chess and Thomas found was starting at the age of 5 days of age, people demonstrate these very specific personality traits. So it's not my fault if my son has a bad, well, maybe genetically, maybe it's my fault, okay. But it doesn't mean I did anything bad when he was 2. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, I don't know. All right, so in a sense, they found that there are certain aspects of personality that are ingrained. And what they suggested is really, you can't say what's a successful parenting style and what's not a successful parenting style. They argued that the best parenting style demonstrates goodness of fit. If your child doesn't like stimulation and has trouble with stimulation, then why would you put them in environments where they're having this kind of stimulation that causes them to have problems? If your child is slow to warm up, then you as a parent want to take that into account when you introduce new things to them. On the other hand, if your kid is very active and needs stimulation, then you should treat that child that way. And so what Chess and Thomas suggested for the best outcomes are what we would call goodness of fit, which is, I guess, if you will, a little bit of nurture. And another model on raising children and developing successful adults out of the parent-child relationship was suggested by this lady, Diana Baumrein. And she's got a 2-dimensional model of raising children with a healthy self-concept. And she argues that great parenting is a combination of 2 things: control and acceptance. Okay, so as your parent, I am the one who sets the limits for you. I must control your behavior. Okay, so there's a certain amount of control that you can exhibit as a parent. Some parents control every aspect of their child's lives. Some parents don't really care what their kids are doing, right? On the other hand, there's a dimension we might call acceptance. Listening to your child, knowing that you care about me, Mom. We'll call that acceptance or warmth or responsiveness, if you will. Some parents are very, very responsive to their children, and some parents don't seem to pay attention to their kids at all. Now, when you're being a great parent, and all of us can be a great parent at sometimes, you're engaged in what we might call authoritative parenting. You set the limits for your kid, but you're still willing to listen to their opinion. That's the great, perfect parent. However, we're not all great parents all the time. And so, if you had to think of your parents, what kind of parenting style did they use when they weren't being perfect parents? Were your parents authoritarians, telling you the rules and telling you, I'll beat your if you don't do this or that? Did you have those kind of parents? Did you have permissive parents that loved you so much they couldn't make you cry when you did something wrong, and so you got away with murder? That was me. That was my style. I was the spoiled kid, right? Because I was the baby out of a bunch, so they let me get away with murder. And then some people have the parents who just are uninvolved. They don't really care what the child does. They don't care what their child does one way or the other. So I would like for you to think about this. When your parents aren't being perfect, okay, what parenting style do they demonstrate? And Olivia, since you are a mom, I hate to pick on you, when you're not being this perfect mother, and I know you're not all the time because none of us are, which parenting style might you be? And you don't even have to say it out loud. Let's see. Or you can say it out loud. Olivia says that when she's needs to, she's a little more authoritarian. Okay, that's all right. I get it. I was raised in the South too. I got those authoritarian parents, right? Okay, great. Okay, so Sarah. Sarah has 6 kids, and each one has their own personality since birth. Wow. Sarah, what kind of mother are you when you have time? Wow, that's amazing. That's pretty crazy, don't you? Right? That is awesome. Okay. Right? We had 2, and that was hard enough. Now, right, good point. Right, clearly. And one last thing, I won't say on it too long, but some people even think that your attachment style as an infant, the bonding with your parents, predicts how you're going to bond with other people as an adult. And one of the specific areas that's been looked at is this idea of romantic attachment. For better or for worse, when you meet somebody and fall in love, you bond with them and you have a close relationship just like you did with your parents and moms, your moms and your dads. And what they argue in this research, Hazan and Shaver, is that people's attachment style and romantic relationships may be similar to the relationship that they had as a child. And what they'll do is they'll bring adults like you into the laboratory. They'll ask them to describe their earliest memories of their relationships with their parents. Okay, and then based upon what William tells me about his early memories, I'm going to try to guess his attachment style. Well, his parents were clearly, he had an anxious, ambivalent, or resistant relationship with his mom, because that's what he described. I then have him fill out this questionnaire here saying, hey, how do you like your romantic relationships to go? Okay, and what they find is that people tend to pick a romantic relationship style that is similar to the one they describe as children. Have any of you ever dated a person that won't leave you alone? They're so clingy that they call you 10, 15 times a day, won't leave you alone. You're like, dude, I'm trying to have lunch. I'm at work. Leave me alone, right? Those clingy persons. Has anybody ever had a relationship partner that won't share anything at all with you and is closed off as if they don't trust you and they don't want to tell you anything? Those are attachment styles, adult romantic attachment styles that some people have. And Hazan and Shaver seem to think that they relate to your earliest experience. I don't know. That'll be up to you to think about. All right, now, one other area where we can talk about language, nature versus nurture, is language development. B.F. Skinner actually thought that we learned language using positive reinforcement. When you say cookie, your mom gives you a cookie. what could be more straightforward reinforcement, right? When you say more cookies, you get more cookies, right? And so and so and so and so, and you build a language environmentally. And sort of that was the nurturist point of view. But it turns out there's evidence to suggest that we have something built in our brain which automatically is going to accept and create language. In fact, Noam Chomsky, the very famous linguist, called it a language acquisition device. Absent brain damage, your brain will accept some language. What language? It doesn't matter what language, be it Russian, Serbian, Chinese, or whatever. Your brain is programmed to accept a language. Now, interesting things of evidence about this biological nature of language. I mentioned the Jeannie Wiley case study, I think. I'm not sure when I mentioned it in this class, but I think I've mentioned it. Jeannie Wiley actually was not exposed to language until she was 11 years of age. And it turns out she grew up in an abusive household in California, in LA, and her dad tied her to a crib and locked her in her bedroom for the first 11 years of her life. They fed her through a hole in the door, and nobody was allowed to talk to her. Her dad was crazy, right? Okay, and so when the cops finally found her, she had grown about the size of your typical 6-year-old. Even though she was 11, she was the size of a 6-year-old, and she couldn't speak. All she could do was grunt. And the idea was the psychologist intervened and said, let's teach her how to speak a language. And it turns out that Jeannie Wiley was never able to learn a language. She could not figure the grammar and the syntax out. She learned some words, but she never learned to produce language like any of you or any of us do. Yes, ma'am? What now? They would call her a feral child, and there are several examples of feral children who, there's the Siberian dog girl Oksana, whose parents were too drunk and were alcoholics, didn't pay attention to her. She crawled out of the house one night into the dog pen and lived with the dogs for about 7 years. And when you see video of her, she looks kind of doggish in her behavior and her barks and all that, right? So we do have this critical period. You know what? I'm even going to suggest there's another critical period. If you're interested, read The Linguistic Genius of Babies. It turns out that there are over 200 sounds you can make with your mouth, a vocal box, a tongue, and some lips. These sounds are called phonemes. Ba 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 ba, da da da, ah, la, r. Those are all sounds you can make with your mouth. It turns out that every language uses a subset of those sounds. So there are some sounds that they make in Arabic that you don't make in English. There are some sounds you make in Spanish that you don't make in English. There are some sounds in English that you make that you don't make in Mandarin Chinese. And the weird thing is, your brain becomes programmed during the first year to hear the sounds in your language, and your brain actually becomes deaf to the sound changes that are used in other languages. So have you folks ever heard, we have this stereotype of the native Asian person who maybe can't say the L versus the R, right? That's because they don't have the L or the R, the glide, I think it's called a liquid, they don't have that sound in their language. So the baby's brain doesn't learn how to hear that difference. So you take the adult Asian who's never heard English and you try to show them that sound, their brain won't even register that they hear that. And same thing if you're the Caucasian trying to learn Spanish. I promise you, all of your Hispanic friends will laugh at you when you try to say Rio. You know, you roll the R's And please don't anybody laugh at my Spanish, okay? And it turns out that we have a critical period for learning dialect. Dialect. All right? So, Noam Chomsky, humans have a language acquisition device. Why did he say this? Well, it turns out that children all learn language at about the same rate in the same way. Remember we talked about milestones on Monday? Our bodies unfold. First we learn how to move our neck, then we learn how to move our arm, then we learn how to move our legs. Language follows a very predictable milestone pattern. And Chomsky said, if language is cultural, if it's environmental, then different cultures should learn language in different manners. But it turns out no matter where you go around the world, no matter what language, you're going to see that children are going to say their first word, be it in Mandarin or English, around 12 months. If you have a child that doesn't speak and that has hearing problems, that is learning to sign, that child is going to start signing simple sentences called telegraphic sentences during their second year. Even if they're not using their language, their mouth, their language ability is going to follow the same form. So all of us around the world start making vocalizations, voluntary vocalizations in a couple of months. All children start practicing their consonants around the age of 6 months. Ba, 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 da, da, da. Your child's not saying da, da. Your kid's not saying daddy. That's just the first thing your kid can say, da, da, mama, ba, ba. They're practicing their consonants. Most kids are going to say their first word around 12 months. Kids are going to start saying sentences around 18 months. And what you're going to see is in every culture, their vocabulary is going to absolutely explode during the second year of life. And it turns out that your child is still going to say really embarrassing things at 3 years old because they haven't learned that sometimes there are things we don't say because they're impolite, right? Mom, what's that funny mark on that man's face? You know what I mean? The pragmatic speech, knowing how to have a conversation. You know, I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak. That's pragmatic ability, and that is going to develop last. And what you're going to see is that every culture is going to have this sort of linear progression for language. How could it be if it's just environment? And what he found is that children learn grammar even though we don't teach them grammar. We don't teach them how to conjugate. They sort of figure it out. And the crazy thing is you'll hear kids make mistakes and they'll say things that they never heard because those aren't words. Your child will say, I goed to the store today. I goed to the store today. Now, what's the proper word? I what? I went to the store. But why would your kid say, I goed to the store?
Because you put ED for the past tenses for most of the stuff.
Isn't that brilliant? Nobody told your child that, but your child managed to figure that syntax out just by hearing language and having the ability to decode and produce that. And then your child's going to make up their own words based upon their knowledge of the rules. And so that's innate. That's in the brain. And then he argued, Chomsky argued that even if you can do all of this stuff and program it, really there's something about the meaning of words. If you think about it, this sentence makes perfect sense. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's a grammatically perfect sentence, is it not? But what is it missing? What is it missing? It doesn't mean a damn thing. Doesn't mean a thing, right? And so he realized that there's something different between the surface structure, the words that we apply to things, and the meaning. And in fact, the crazy thing is, I can say, I went to the store yesterday, or I can say, yesterday I went to the store. All right? Yesterday I was at the store. I was at the store yesterday. Yesterday I was not here. I was at the store. We can say the same thing and we can say it all kinds of different ways. But they mean the same thing. And so he argued that this has to be built in the brain. And so the question is environment versus nature. We would argue that language is probably more nature than nurture. Oh my goodness, finally. All right, and then one last question. How do we learn to think? You folks are all sitting here looking at me thinking, I don't know what you're thinking, but you're all thinking. How many of you have ever wondered, how do we get here to where we are? Is there some sort of natural way that our brains all progress? Or do we all manage, because we all think about the same way, we all have the same types of thoughts. How do we all have these similar thoughts? Is it because we're trained exactly the same way by the environment? Or is there some sort of genetic, predisposed programming of how language develops? And what I'd like to do is mention this fellow named Jean Piaget. He's actually the most important psychologist in history. Nobody's been cited more than this guy. The number of times people reference you in a paper is generally a statement of how important we think you are. Nobody's been cited more than this guy. And he actually, he had a theory of cognitive development he called genetic epistemology. He argued that our brains evolve, mind, this thing in your brain we call a mind, evolves just like a butterfly might evolve from a cocoon. And he argued that our brain evolved through 4 stages of thinking, all right? And he argued that really what we have are these things called schemes, knowledge structures. What's a knowledge structure? Hold a cup. That's a knowledge structure. If I don't want this cup to fall, I need to hold it. You don't think about it, but you learn that at some point. You learned if I hear a sound and I want to see it, I look that way. That's knowledge. You learn that at some point. Now, you do things that are way more complex. Now you go to grandma's house and take casserole, okay? But it's all composed of these knowledge structures called schemes. And he argued that we start with these schemes that develop from our instincts. So you have a sucking reflex, right? You accidentally, your thumb winds its way into your mouth one day in your 2nd or 3rd month. You suck on it and you go, wow, I kind of like that. It feels good. And that is a plan. And then you start sticking everything else in your mouth to see what else is fun to suck on. And if you've ever seen an infant, that's what they do. They put stuff in their mouth. Everything they see, they're putting in their mouth. According to Piaget, they are testing out their scheme, their stuff tastes good scheme. And what they're doing is they're figuring out what things you can put in the mouth. We're going to assimilate those things. So candy, cookies, a thumb, a toy in my mouth, that's good. But then your kid's also going to put stuff in their mouth like dirt, and they're going to find out that's not such a good thing to do. And so they're going to change that schema. And he argued that children have these schemas that build up, and then our brain evolves through 4 stages of cognitive ability. Quickly, okay? Number 1, he argues that human beings go through this period, your first 2 years of your life, where you are presymbolic. You don't even have a mind. He argues you're stuck in what he would call your sensory experiences and your motor experiences. If you're not touching it, it's out of your mind. And he found that children before the age of 2 seem to demonstrate these 2 really crazy inabilities. Children don't know that objects exist if they're not looking at them. You can take an object in front of a 12-month-old, let's say these are their toys and they really like it, and I can put that down in front of you and the kid will try to grab it. You'll take a napkin and put it right over it, and the kid will immediately look somewhere else, almost as if they've forgotten that there's an object hiding under there. It's called object permanence, and you don't develop that. It turns out that kids really suck at playing hide and seek because they don't know how to look for things until they're 4 and 5 and 6. They're really not good at looking for hidden things. And then he found that children don't seem to recognize themselves in the mirror until they're about 2 years of age. He would test this with what they called the Rouge test. They'd put a mark unobtrusively on the kid's face. You then stick the kid in front of a mirror, and if the kid does this, that means they realize that they're looking at themselves. And it turns out that humans and some of your smarter animals recognize themselves in a mirror, but not all. And what he found was that children, before about the age of 2, aren't really good with the object permanence task or the objective self-awareness task. So he argued that children are pre-symbolic. Okay? He then argued from 2 to 6, children are symbolic, but they're not very logical. Any of you folks ever heard of Santa Claus? Check this story out. There's this guy. He has all the toys you've ever seen in the whole world. He loads them into the back of a sled pulled by 8 reindeer, and he flies around the entire world in one night and delivers toys to everybody down their chimney, even if they don't have a fireplace. What's wrong with that? That's impossible. It's the stupidest, most illogical thing you've ever seen. And yet every 4-year-old in the world buys that story without even thinking about it, man. It's because they're symbolic but not logical. I'm not going to bore yourself, but there are tasks he did. He called them conservation tasks, where he would test a kid's ability to engage in logical operations. And he found that kids from 2 to 4 or 5 are just totally have no sense of logic. Okay? However, starting around 5 or 6, they start to get a little bit logical. And by 7, he argues that children move into their 3rd stage he called concrete operational. Kids are logical, but they're not very good at abstract thinking. Now, if any of you are going to be a teacher in grade school, one of the things they're going to teach you is that you can never teach a 4th grader something without letting them touch it or play with it or see a picture of it, okay? Anytime you go to a museum, they always have a kid zone, and you'll notice the kid zone is where kids can play with things and manipulate things. What Piaget found was that kids between the ages of 7 and 12, your primary school, they're logical, but they don't have they're not good at thinking about things abstractly. Okay? And so he argues that we go through a sort of a concrete period where we're logical but not abstract. And this is, those of you who are going to be a teacher, I swear to God, you're going to learn all about Piaget if you're teaching elementary school kids, and they're going to talk about manipulating things and touching them and seeing them. Okay? And then finally he argues that some of us are going to make it to true critical thinking. He argues starting around the age of 12 or 13, some of us develop critical thinking abilities. Now, he argued that not everybody has critical thinking abilities. If you've ever walked around and talked to adults, you're going to know that a lot of adults aren't really good at solving problems. They're really good at parroting things that they've heard said, but not many people really truly sit down and can think through abstractions that well. One of the things that college is, it's an abstract thinking factory. We have you practice your abstract thinking ability. That's what we're doing. Solve problems. Think about the pros and the cons of something. We're trying to get you to engage in this. What he argued was that some people develop the ability for logical and abstract thinking. And he argued this ability is called hypothetico-deductive reasoning. That's being able to guess what's going to happen before you absolutely do something. Did any of you ever do something as a teenage kid or a young kid, and after something went wrong, your parents said, well, why did you do that? Didn't you know what was going to happen? I remember we used to play baseball out behind these apartments with a tennis ball. Right? And you could bang it up against the wall of the apartment. It was kind of cool to hit a home run and see it hit somebody's apartment. Well, one day, my friend brought a real baseball out there, and we were like, let's just play with this real baseball. It turns out when you hit a real baseball against a glass window, it breaks. Never even crossed my mind. Now, if my dad had caught me, we all ran, but if my dad had caught me, I'm sure he would have said, didn't you bother to think about what would happen? I'm 11. No, I did not, Dad. One of the things that you will develop the ability to do is to hypothesize how things will be in the future. Okay, we are at 2:30, and I know I have absolutely bored you. What I'm going to do is let you read about Erik Erikson on your own. Erik Erikson's a guy that wrote a theory about personality development. He argued that we all go through 8 crises in our life where we have to resolve important issues. The first year of your life, you have to learn, can I trust the world? Pretty reasonable lesson. When you're 8 years old, you have to learn, can I make something good? Right? Am I good at stuff? When you're 4, you have to learn how to share. Can I share things? Can I take a turn? Now that you're 18, you're trying to figure out who you are. How many of you have ever heard the term identity crisis? Anybody ever heard that term? Okay, according to this guy, Erik Erikson, every last one of us goes through an identity crisis in our 16 to 20-year-old age. And that's when we're figuring out, who am I as a human being, right? And so I want you to read about Erik Erikson on your own. All right, does anybody have any questions? Okay, in webinar on Thursday night, we're going to be talking about nature versus nurture. I've got some cool videos. We might watch the language videos, I'm not sure. But writing assignment number 4 is due this week. We're always a week behind on the writing assignments, right? I will have writing assignment 3 graded by the end of the weekend. And don't forget to do your homework. Any questions?
Thanks for that last one.
Yeah, right? All right. Take care, folks. Have a great day. I want to thank everybody who came online today. Your 11-month-old does that. Wow, interesting. Thank you very much. Might be 4, might be a little unstable. The comments are very nice. Hey, look, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. Have a great weekend. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in webinar. Take care. Bye. Yes, ma'am. Where? I did. Yeah. Yeah. I did. Mahika, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And did you get me on Monday? I was online.
I bet I did. Let me check just to make sure. I did.
Okay, thank you so much.